Arthur Cunningham sat his horse at the eastern boundary of his holdings, watching the sun struggle through winter clouds. 40,000 acres stretched before him, legal and purchased, every deed signed and recorded in the county seat. The prairie rolled away in shades of brown and gray, and scattered across it lay the carcasses of his cattle. He'd counted 23 head this morning. Yesterday, 17 the week before, more than he cared to tally. The land itself looked punished, where his herds had grazed for 15 years. The prairie's deep-rooted grasses lay trampled and sparse. His fences marked the boundaries in rigid lines, barbed wire strung tight between cedar posts, keeping the world divided into what was his and what wasn't. Cunningham urged his horse forward, his breath visible in the cold air. He knew winter. Kansas winters could be harsh, but they passed. Cattle died. Yes, but ranchers who controlled enough land who'd squeezed out the small operators and consolidated their holdings, survived. He'd built his empire on that principle. The homesteaders had never understood scale. They'd arrive with their wagons and children, stake their 160-acre claims, and try to make farms from rangeland. Cunningham had watched them fail for years. Most left within 2 seasons. The stubborn ones he'd pressured legal maneuvering, bought water rights, positioned his herds to overgraze the borders of their claims until their crops faltered. Business, nothing personal. They called him ruthless in town. He called himself practical. He reached the western section where younger cattle had wintered. More carcasses here, their frozen bodies stark against the pale grass. The losses ran deeper than previous years. Something had shifted the market. The weather. The very economics that had made cattle ranching seem certain. His ranch house stood empty most days. He'd built it large, anticipating a family that never came, a wife who'd left after 2 years, taking nothing but her clothes and her silence. That was a decade past. Now the rooms echoed with his footsteps, filled with furniture no one used. Cunningham turned his horse toward home. The wind cut across the open prairie, finding the gaps in his coat. His banker had sent a telegram yesterday, urgent meeting required. The words had been brief, professional, but Cunningham recognized the tone. Money men didn't use urgent lightly. He'd delayed this ride, this accounting of losses for weeks. Now he couldn't avoid the numbers. 70%, maybe more. The winter wasn't finished, and already his operation bled capital. As he approached the ranch house, he saw his foreman waiting on the porch, holding a second telegram. Cunningham dismounted, tied his horse to the rail. "Came an hour ago, boss," the foreman said. "From the bank." Cunningham took the paper. Read it standing in the cold. The meeting wasn't a request anymore. It was tomorrow, 10 o'clock, mandatory attendance. He folded the telegram, slipped it into his coat pocket, looked out across his vast holdings, his kingdom of grass and wire and legal deeds. For the first time in 15 years, Arthur Cunningham felt something close to fear. The bank sat on Main Street in Medicine Lodge, its brick facade suggesting permanence in a territory built on speculation. Cunningham arrived exactly at 10, tied his horse outside, entered through doors he'd passed through 100 times as a valued client. Thomas Brennan's office smelled of pipe tobacco and ledger ink. The banker sat behind his desk, his expression carefully neutral. 2 chairs faced him, but Brennan gestured to 4 seats arranged along the wall. "We'll need the space," Brennan said. "Others are joining us." "Others?" Before Brennan could answer, the door opened. Margaret Hayes entered first, followed by 3 men Cunningham recognized from the farms bordering his property. People he'd pressured, people whose water access he'd complicated, whose boundaries his cattle had trampled. Margaret wore a simple dress, wool and practical. Her dark hair pulled back. She was perhaps 40, her face weathered by sun and work. She met Cunningham's stare without flinching. "Mrs. Hayes," Brennan said. "Gentlemen, please sit." They arranged themselves. Margaret directly across from Cunningham. She carried a leather folder, placed it on her lap with the confidence of someone who'd prepared. Brennan cleared his throat. "Arthur, your loan payments are 60 days overdue. The spring payment is due in 8 weeks, and based on your cattle losses, you won't meet it." Markets will recover, Cunningham said. They always do. Not fast enough. Your collateral has diminished by 70%. The bank's position is exposed. Cunningham's jaw tightened. Then extend the terms. We've done business 15 years. Thomas, I can't extend what can't be repaid. Brennan nodded toward Margaret, which is why I asked Mrs. Hayes to present her proposal. Margaret opened her folder, removed several pages of figures. She slid them across the desk toward Cunningham. We don't want charity. Mr. Cunningham, she said. Her voice carried a slight accent. Swedish, maybe. We want partnership. Cunningham glanced at the papers. Columns of numbers, yield projections, soil analyses, partnership. Your land is damaged from overgrazing, but the prairie's roots run deep. Cattle compact the soil, destroy what makes this land valuable. Wheat doesn't. The grasses that make poor grazing make perfect wheat cultivation. One of the men leaned forward, Hans Muller, German, displaced 2 years ago. We have been planting test plots on the marginal sections you abandoned. The yields are exceptional. Cunningham looked at Brennan. You brought me here for a farming lecture. I brought you here, Brennan said quietly, because wheat prices are soaring and your cattle operation is dead. Listen to them, Margaret continued, unruffled by Cunningham's tone. We propose converting your land to wheat farming. We provide the expertise. You provide the land and equipment, tenant farming with profit sharing, 60-40 split, our favor, for the first 3 years. 60-40. Cunningham laughed, but the sound felt hollow in the quiet office. We could buy land ourselves eventually, Margaret said, but that takes time we don't have. You have land you don't understand how to use. My late husband came from Sweden. He recognized this prairie, the same deep roots, the same soil structure. He understood what it could grow. Your husband's dead, Cunningham said. His knowledge isn't. Another man spoke, Lars Johansson, Norwegian. We have been farming for generations, crop rotation, nitrogen fixings, soil conservation. These are not new techniques in Europe. They're only new to you. Cunningham stood. I'm not farming. I'm a cattleman. You're bankrupt, Brennan said. Sit down. Arthur. The words hit like a physical blow. Cunningham remained standing. But his certainty wavered. Margaret pulled out more papers, photographs of the test plots, showing green wheat standing tall against brown surrounding prairie. We planted these in November on land you considered worthless. The winter hasn't touched them. That's not luck, that's understanding. Brennan tapped his desk. I've reviewed their numbers. If even half their yield projections hold, you'll meet your loan obligations. Your cattle won't save you. This might. Cunningham looked at the faces around him, people he'd dismissed as failures, as obstacles to progress. Now they sat in a banker's office, offering to rescue him with knowledge he didn't possess. His pride demanded he refuse. His banker's expression said refusal wasn't an option. 10% of my land, Cunningham said finally. Trial basis. We'll see how one harvest goes. Margaret nodded. Acceptable. We'll draw up contracts, equal terms. Mr. Cunningham, we're not your laborers. We're your partners. The word tasted like ash in his mouth, but he nodded. Brennan produced contract templates. They spent the next hour negotiating terms. Cunningham conceding points he'd never imagined conceding. Margaret proving as sharp with legal language as she was with agricultural science. When they finished, Cunningham signed his name to a partnership with people he'd spent years trying to destroy. 3 days later, Cunningham rode to the test plots on his eastern sections. Margaret waited there with Lars and Hans, along with 2 younger men Cunningham didn't recognize. My sons, Margaret said. Eric and James. They'll be managing day-to-day planting operations. The younger men nodded respectfully but didn't extend their hands. Cunningham didn't offer his. The test plots occupied 5 acres of land Cunningham had written off years ago, too rocky, too exposed to wind, yet green wheat stood in neat rows. 8 inches tall despite the season. How? Cunningham asked, before he could stop himself. Margaret walked into the field. Kneel down, look at the roots. Cunningham hesitated. His ranch hands had never asked him to kneel in dirt, but something in Margaret's tone, not commanding, but matter of fact. The way one speaks to someone who genuinely doesn't know something made him dismount and crouch beside her. She pulled up a sample plant gently. Showing the root system. See how deep they go, 3 feet already. And they'll reach 6 by summer. The prairie grasses have roots that go down 10, 15 feet. Your cattle destroyed the surface grasses, but the deep structure remains. Wheat uses that structure. Hans joined them. In Germany, we learned to read soil. This prairie is like the Russian steppes' tough surface, but tremendous fertility below. Cattle compact the earth, wheat breaks it open. We rotate crops, Lars added. This year wheat. Next year we plant alfalfa to fix nitrogen back into the soil. Third year wheat again. The land renews itself if you understand the cycle. Cunningham examined the root system, the healthy green stalks. He'd owned this land for 12 years and never understood it. Your cattle operation worked against the land's nature, Margaret said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. This works with it. They spent the afternoon walking the sections designated for conversion. Margaret and her team had surveyed it all, created planting schedules, calculated seed requirements. They spoke in technical terms. Cunningham barely followed winter wheat versus spring wheat, broadcasting versus drilling. The importance of planting depth. He'd built an empire on cattle, on controlling access to grazing land and water. But these people spoke of agriculture with a precision that made ranching seem crude. As the sun lowered, Eric, Margaret's older son, approached Cunningham. We'll need to repair your equipment shed. The plows you have are inadequate. They were good enough for my operation. For cattle, sure. For farming. Eric shook his head. We'll need proper turning plows. A grain drill if we can afford it. Otherwise we broadcast by hand and accept lower yields. I'll provide what's necessary, Cunningham said stiffly. Margaret overheard. We'll make a list. Some equipment we can build ourselves. The rest we'll need to purchase. It comes out of operating costs before profit calculations. Always the numbers. Always the careful accounting. Cunningham had run his ranch more on instinct and force of will. These farmers ran theirs like a ledger. Every input and output measured. Riding home that evening, Cunningham looked back at his vast holdings. 40,000 acres he thought he'd mastered. Now he wondered what else he'd failed to see. What other knowledge he'd dismissed as irrelevant. The question troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The months between January and April passed in a rhythm Cunningham had never known. Each day he rode to the planting sections, worked alongside Margaret's team, and learned. Lars taught him about soil drainage, how to read the land's natural contours. They walked fields together. Lars pointing out subtle slopes Cunningham had never noticed. Water flows here, Lars said, indicating a gentle depression. In spring, this becomes bog. We don't plant wheat there. We plant it along the rises, where drainage is good. Hans showed him the German method of crop rotation. They stood in a field marked into thirds on Margaret's maps. This section had wheat last year. See how the soil is depleted. This year we rest it with alfalfa. The alfalfa's roots bring nitrogen from the air into the earth. Next year, this section grows wheat again, and the yields will be higher. How much higher? Cunningham asked. 20%, maybe 30%. The land teaches you if you listen, Margaret herself explained. Seed selection. They sat in Cunningham's equipment shed, repaired now. Organized with tools Cunningham barely recognized, sorting wheat seed by hand. Turkey red wheat, Margaret said, letting the seeds run through her fingers. Mennonite farmers brought it from Russia. It survives the winter better than any American variety. My husband Carl learned about it from a Mennonite settlement in Kansas. Your husband, Cunningham said carefully. How long has he been gone? 4 years. Margaret's hands didn't stop sorting. Pneumonia. Quick. At least, he'd taught me everything he knew before he died. Not because he knew he'd die, but because we worked as partners. He never assumed farming was man's work and I was just helping. Cunningham thought of his own marriage. His assumption that his wife should manage the house while he managed the land. She'd left, and he'd never understood why. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. He gave me knowledge that's worth more than gold in country like this. By March, Cunningham's hands were rough from work he'd never done himself. Fence repair, plow maintenance, seed preparation. His ranch hands watched with barely concealed confusion as their boss labored alongside homesteaders. One afternoon, Cunningham was plowing test furrows under Hans's supervision. He set the blade depth wrong, too shallow, and started the pass. Hans stopped him. No, deeper, 8 inches. Not 4, Cunningham bristled. I've been plowing this land longer than you've been in Kansas. You've been scratching it. Plowing requires depth. Show me why 4 inches works better, and I'll agree. Otherwise, set it to 8. Cunningham's first instinct was anger, but Hans waited patiently, not challenging, just confident, certain of his knowledge. Show me why 8 inches, Cunningham said finally. Hans knelt, dug into the earth with his hands. Feel this. 4 inches gets surface soil, already depleted. 8 inches turns the deeper layer, brings fresh soil up to air and light. The wheat roots go down 3, 4 feet. You need to prepare the depth they'll use. Cunningham adjusted the plow. The work was harder, the blade cutting deeper. But when he looked back at the furrow, the turned earth was darker, richer, better, Hans said simply. By April, fence lines that had marked rigid boundaries became paths Cunningham crossed daily. He knew the settlers' names now, their children's names, where they'd come from. Eric and James, Margaret's sons, were 22 and 19 strong. Smart, more educated than Cunningham had assumed. Eric read agricultural journals from Europe, translated techniques his father had taught him into American contexts. One evening, Cunningham found himself staying late at the planting site, talking with Lars about Norwegian growing seasons, how they'd adapted short summer techniques to the American prairie. When he finally rode home, his mansion felt emptier than usual. The echo of his footsteps in unused rooms seemed louder. He'd built something vast and hollow. He realized these farmers with their small homesteads had something he'd never created: community, purpose, knowledge that connected generations. The thought followed him into uneasy sleep. Margaret's invitation came in late April, delivered by Eric. Mother's hosting supper tomorrow. She'd like you to come. Cunningham almost refused. Social gatherings with homesteaders felt wrong, a crossing of boundaries he'd spent years establishing. But Eric waited patiently for an answer, and Cunningham heard himself saying yes. Margaret's homestead sat on a quarter section she'd purchased with money earned from farm labor after Carl died. The house was small, well-built, surrounded by a vegetable garden and a chicken coop. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of baking bread. Cunningham dismounted, suddenly aware he'd dressed in his ranch clothes, fine wool, polished boots. Everyone else wore simple work garments. Margaret greeted him at the door. Mr. Cunningham, welcome. Inside, a long table filled most of the main room. 10 people sat there already: Lars and his wife Anna, Hans and his daughter Greta, the Muller sons. 2 families. Cunningham didn't know. They made space, pulled up another chair. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, potatoes, bread still warm from the oven. But the conversation flowed easily, people talking over each other in a mix of English and German and Swedish, laughing at shared jokes. Anna Johansson asked about Cunningham's ranch house. Eric says it's very large. Too large, Cunningham admitted. Built for a family I don't have. An awkward silence followed. Then Hans said, my father in Germany built a big house too. Wanted to show the neighbors he'd succeeded after he died. My mother couldn't heat all the rooms in winter. She lived in just the kitchen, all that space wasted. The conversation moved on, but Cunningham sat with the observation. His mansion, his vast holdings, who were they for what had he been proving after dinner? Margaret brought coffee, and Cunningham found himself talking with her on the small porch while others cleaned inside. Your husband, Cunningham said. Carl, how did he learn farming? From his father, who learned from his father in Sweden. You don't own land the way you do here. You inherit small plots, work them your whole life, pass them to your children. Carl grew up understanding that land is something you serve, Not something you control. I've controlled mine for 15 years. Have you? Margaret's tone was gentle but direct. Or have you fought it, trying to make it into something it isn't? Cunningham sipped his coffee. Let the question sit. Through the window, he could see the others laughing. Eric demonstrating something with his hands, but James shaking his head in amused disagreement. I displaced families, Cunningham said quietly. People like you, like the Johanssons and Mullers. I used legal tactics, water rights, strategic grazing. Made it impossible for them to succeed. I know. Do you hate me for it? Margaret considered. Hate takes energy I need for other things. You did what the system rewarded. Now the system has changed, and you're changing with it. That's more than most powerful men do. I'm not changing by choice. I'm changing because I'm broke. Does it matter why you're here? Learning to, working beside us. You asked Hans to show you why 8 inches instead of 4. That question matters more than your reasons for asking. Inside, someone started singing a Swedish song Cunningham didn't understand. Others joined in, voices blending in harmony. They do this every week, Margaret said. Gather said, share food, but said, sing. It's how we survive the isolation. You should come more often. I'm not sure I'd be welcome. You're here now, aren't you? Cunningham stayed until late, listening to songs in languages he didn't speak. Watching families interact with an ease he'd never known. When he finally rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, his mansion loomed dark and silent. He lit a single lamp, sat in his study, and for the first time in years, felt the full weight of his loneliness. Not the loneliness of being unmarried, but the loneliness of isolation he'd chosen, built, defended with fences and legal deeds. The homesteaders lived in small houses, but their lives were full. His vast holdings felt empty by comparison. May brought the final accounting. Cunningham's remaining cattle, the 30% that survived winter, were too weak to recover. Market prices had collapsed further. Eastern demand shifting to beef from Texas operations that had weathered the season better. His foreman delivered the news in simple terms. We're finished, boss. Even if we sell every head, we won't cover feed costs. Cunningham rode through his holdings, seeing them through Margaret's eyes now. The overgrazed sections where nothing grew, the compacted soil around water sources. Years of cattle ranching had damaged the land's fundamental capacity. He'd thought he was building an empire. He'd been strip mining the prairie. The mortgage payment came due in June. Brennan sent a polite letter without the cattle operations revenue. Foreclosure would begin in 90 days unless alternative income appeared. Cunningham sat in his study, surrounded by maps of his 40,000 acres, and faced the truth. 15 years of accumulation, legal maneuvering, strategic dominance, and he'd built nothing sustainable. The first serious crisis had shattered everything. Margaret found him there 2 days later. She knocked, entered without waiting for invitation. The wheat is growing well, she said. We need to expand the planting if you want to survive this. Expand with what capital? I'm bankrupt, Mrs. Hayes. Then we invest more labor, less equipment. We broadcast seed by hand instead of using drills. We make do. She sat across from him. We can convert another 10,000 acres by fall planting if we start now, but we need your commitment. To what? Becoming a farmer. To working instead of controlling. You've spent 15 years trying to dominate this land. That's finished. Now you learn to cooperate with it. Cunningham looked at his maps. 40,000 acres. Soon to belong to the bank unless wheat saved him. Pride and practicality warred in his chest. What do you need? He asked. Your labor, your willingness to take direction instead of giving it, access to your equipment and remaining capital for seed. I'll be a hired hand on my own land. You'll be a partner. There's a difference. That afternoon, Cunningham rode to his southern fence line, the boundary separating his ranch from the Johansson property. The fence had stood for 8 years, marking territory and maintaining division. He dismounted, pulled wire cutters from his saddlebag, and began cutting. Lars appeared on his side of the fence, watching. What are you doing? Mr. Cunningham. Making access. We'll need to move equipment between properties. The fence is in the way. Lars crossed through the gap, helped pull down the wire and posts. They worked in silence, dismantling the barrier Cunningham had erected to keep homesteaders out. When they'd cleared a 40-foot section, Lars said, "This is not easy for you." "No." "Good. Easy lessons don't change us." They stacked the posts, rolled the wire where the fence had been. Open prairie stretched continuous. Cunningham felt simultaneously exposed and freed. By evening, word had spread. Margaret's team arrived with planting schedules for the expanded acreage. They sat in Cunningham's dining room, the first time anyone besides himself had used it in years, and planned the fall wheat crop. Eric unrolled maps. "We'll plant 10,000 acres in September. Another 5,000 in October. If winter cooperates and we get good germination, next year's harvest could clear your debts." "Could," Cunningham said. "Farming's never certain," Margaret said, "but neither was cattle ranching. At least this works with the land instead of against it." Cunningham studied the maps, seeing his property transformed from grazing sections to planting zones. His empire was dissolving into something else, something he didn't control but might survive through. "Let's begin," he said. The summer passed in brutal labor. Cunningham worked beside Margaret's crew, preparing soil, repairing equipment, and organizing the seed purchases that would determine fall planting success. His body ached in ways it never had. His hands blistered. Calloused, blistered again, but the work kept darker thoughts at bay. At night, alone in his mansion, they returned. He'd received letters from fellow cattlemen, men he'd considered colleagues. They'd heard about his wheat partnership, his work with homesteaders. The letters were polite but cold, suggesting he'd betrayed ranching principles, aligned himself with the wrong class of people. Cunningham burned the letters, but couldn't burn the isolation they represented. He'd built his identity on being a cattle baron, on controlling vast holdings, on forcing out the weak to consolidate the strong. Now the weak were saving him, and the strong had abandoned him to bankruptcy. One August night, unable to sleep, Cunningham walked through his mansion's rooms. 14 rooms, most never used, furniture covered in dust sheets, windows looking out on darkness. In his father's study, he'd inherited the ranch. Built it larger, Cunningham found old correspondence, letters his father had written, forcing homesteaders off land, celebrating legal victories that expanded their holdings. The Johansson family had been among them. Cunningham remembered now his father had diverted water from their claim, made farming impossible. Lars's family had left Kansas, returned to Norway. Lars had come back years later, started over on different land, and now Lars taught Cunningham how to plow. The weight of it settled over him, not guilt exactly, but recognition of cost. How many families had his ambition displaced? How many Carl Hayeses had died trying to farm land the Cunninghams had made unworkable? He couldn't undo it. Couldn't resurrect the dead or restore lost years, but he could apologize, confess. Thunder rumbled outside. Cunningham stood at the window, watching lightning illuminate his prairie. Storm coming, the kind that could save crops or destroy them depending on timing and intensity. A knock at the door. Cunningham checked his pocket watch near midnight. He opened the door to find Margaret standing there, soaked from rain. "The wheat?" she said. "We need to check the drainage in the low sections. If this storm floods them, you came in this weather to get me. We're partners. Partners work together during crisis." They rode through the storm, rain driving sideways, lightning showing the prairie in stark flashes, reached the low sections where new wheat was establishing. Water pooled but hadn't flooded yet. Margaret and Cunningham dug drainage channels in the dark and rain, working until the water flowed away from the wheat roots. By dawn, exhausted and mud-covered, and they sat on Cunningham's porch watching the storm clear. "Why do you trust me?" Cunningham asked. "After everything my family did to yours, to the Johanssons, to all of them, why offer partnership instead of revenge?" Margaret pulled off her wet hat, wrung it out. "Revenge doesn't plant wheat, doesn't feed my sons. Carl used to say the land doesn't care about our grudges. It just wants to grow things if we let it. I don't deserve your help." "Deserve?" Margaret shook her head. "This isn't about deserve. It's about survive. We need your land. You need our knowledge. Deserving doesn't enter into it. Cunningham watched the sun rise over fields they'd just saved, felt something shift inside him, not redemption. Nothing so clean, just the beginning of understanding that his old certainties had been illusions. "We'll make this work," he said. "We will," Margaret agreed. "Now go sleep. Planting starts in 3 weeks, and you'll need strength." Late summer turned to early fall. The September planting went smoothly. The wheat seed drilled into prepared soil under clear skies. October brought the second planting, expanding coverage to 15,000 acres total. Then came waiting. Winter would test the wheat, prove whether Margaret's knowledge and Cunningham's gamble would pay. The winter was mild, cold enough to vernalize the wheat, encouraging the plant to focus on root development, but not harsh enough to kill. Snow provided moisture without flooding. By March, green shoots appeared across 15,000 acres. Cunningham walked the fields with Eric and examining the growth. "It's working," Eric said. "See the density? We'll get good yields if spring cooperates." Spring cooperated. Warm days, gentle rains, sunshine that pushed the wheat upward. By June, the field stood waist-high and golden. Harvest began in late June. Cunningham had purchased 2 mechanical reapers with money borrowed against the expected wheat income. Margaret's crew worked them expertly, cutting and bundling wheat in long rows across the prairie. The first day of harvest, Cunningham worked a reaper himself, learning the machine's rhythm. Beside him, Hans drove the second reaper, behind them. Women and children bundled and shocked the wheat into standing pyramids for drying. The yields exceeded projections. Margaret ran calculations each evening, recording weights and quality assessments. "We're looking at 30 bushels per acre average, she told Cunningham, "at current prices. That's," she showed him the figures, "enough to clear your mortgage with profit to share." The reality of it settled slowly. Survival. Not just financial, but something deeper, proof that cooperation worked better than dominance. The harvest celebration happened in late July. After the last wagon of wheat had been delivered to the grain elevator in Medicine Lodge, Margaret organized it at Cunningham's ranch the first time his property had hosted a gathering. Families arrived in wagons, carrying food and instruments. They set up tables in the yard, children running between adults, music starting as the sun lowered. Cunningham stood apart initially, unsure of his role. Margaret found him. "You should say something," she said. "These people saved your life. Thank them." Cunningham looked at the gathered crowd. Lars and Anna, Hans and Greta, Eric and James, families he'd learned to know over months of shared work. He stepped forward, raised his hand for quiet. The conversation died down. "I'm not good at speeches," Cunningham said. "Never have been, but I know enough to recognize when I've been given something I didn't earn. You all had every reason to let me fail. Instead, you offered partnership. It taught me what I should have learned years ago, that knowledge matters more than acreage, and cooperation works better than control." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I can't undo the past, can't give back the years my family took from yours, but I can promise that what we built this year continues, and I can use whatever influence I still have to make sure other homesteaders don't face what you faced." Lars stood. "To partnership," he said, raising his cup. "To partnership." The crowd echoed. The celebration continued into night. Cunningham found himself talking with families, learning their stories, understanding the complexity of lives he'd once dismissed as simple. A child asked him to dance, and he did, awkwardly, while others laughed with him rather than at him. Near midnight, sitting with Margaret while others cleaned up, Cunningham said, "I was wrong about everything. Land, power. What makes a successful life? You were..." Margaret agreed. "But you learned that counts for something. Carl would have been proud of you, what you built after he died. He'd be proud of both of us. He believed people could change if they had reason to. You're the proof." Cunningham looked across his property, seeing it transformed, not his empire anymore, their community. Cunningham stood at the eastern boundary of his holdings, the same spot where he'd counted dead cattle 18 months earlier. Autumn sun warmed his back, and before him stretched 15,000 acres of wheat stubble, the remains of the year's second successful harvest. The land looked different now, where brown, overgrazed prairie had dominated. The wheat's root systems had begun healing the soil. Green was returning to sections he'd considered ruined. The deep-rooted grasses Margaret had described were recovering, finding space to regenerate between planting seasons. Across the prairie, homesteads dotted the landscape. Margaret's sons had purchased their own sections, building houses and barns. Lars had expanded his holdings. Hans had brought his brother's family from Germany to take up neighboring land. The population was growing, not from displacement, but from success. Cunningham no longer owned 40,000 acres. He'd sold portions to settlers at fair prices, using the capital to modernize equipment and expand wheat operations on the remaining land. His holdings had shrunk to 20,000 acres, but they were productive now. Sustainable, the fences were mostly gone. Property boundaries existed on maps and deeds, but the physical barriers had come down. Equipment and labor moved freely between farms, shared during planting and harvest. What Cunningham had lost in exclusive control, he'd gained in cooperative efficiency. His role had changed too. The territorial legislature had asked him to testify about sustainable settlement policies. Cunningham, former land baron, cattle operator, homesteader suppressor, now spoke in favor of fair land distribution, against monopolistic practices, supporting the very policies he'd once fought. Other cattlemen called him traitor. Cunningham accepted the label. Better a traitor to a destructive system than loyal to values that had nearly destroyed him. Movement caught his eye. Margaret rode toward him on her sturdy workhorse, her youngest son James riding beside her. "Thought I'd find you here," she said, reining in. "James wants to show you the winter wheat varieties from his new supplier." "European stock?" Cunningham asked James. "Russian. Actually, a Mennonite breeder in McPherson developed a hybrid, cold-hardy and drought-resistant. I think it'll work well on our northern sections." Our sections? The language had shifted from possessive to collective. They rode together toward the central equipment barn, a structure Cunningham had built but which now served 5 farms. Inside, James showed him the seed samples, explained the breeding techniques, discussed planting strategies for November. Cunningham listened, asked questions, deferred to James's expertise. The young man knew more about wheat cultivation than Cunningham would learn in a lifetime. That was fine. Cunningham's knowledge lay elsewhere now, in understanding machinery, managing cooperative finances, navigating legal and political systems to benefit the community rather than himself. That evening, Cunningham stood in his ranch house, smaller now, since he'd closed off the unused rooms, focusing on heating and maintaining just the spaces he needed. The echoing emptiness was gone. The house felt lived in, purposeful. On his desk lay correspondence with the Territorial Agricultural Commissioner, discussing crop diversification strategies. Beside it, Margaret's latest yield projections for next year. A letter from Lars about forming a cooperative grain elevator, cutting out the medicine lodge middlemen who took too large a percentage of harvest profits. Cunningham's world had shrunk in acreage but expanded in connection. He knew his neighbors now, worked beside them, depended on them as they depended on him. The loneliness that had haunted his mansion had dissolved into daily interaction, shared purpose, mutual effort. He couldn't claim to be redeemed. Redemption suggested a clean break with the past, a transformation into someone different. Cunningham was still himself, ambitious, calculating, appetite, driven, but those qualities served different ends now. Instead of accumulation, he pursued sustainability. Instead of dominance, cooperation. The land taught him, as Hans had promised, not through dramatic revelation, but through daily work, seasonal cycles, the patient accumulation of understanding. Wheat required knowledge cattle hadn't. Community required humility isolation had prevented. At 53, Cunningham was learning what he should have understood at 30, that true wealth wasn't measured in acres owned, but in knowledge shared. That power over others was weakness compared to partnership with them. He walked to his window, looked out over the prairie. Winter approached. The wheat already planted would sleep under snow, developing the root systems that would yield next summer's harvest. The cycle continued, ancient and reliable, requiring human cooperation rather than human control. Cunningham had been a land baron. Now he was something better, a community member, a student of the land, a partner in the work of making the prairie productive and sustainable. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real, earned through failure and humiliation and the patient teaching of people he'd once dismissed as beneath him. He'd lost an empire and gained an education. The trade, he'd come to understand, was more than fair. Outside, the autumn stars emerged. The prairie stretched vast and dark, but Cunningham no longer saw it as territory to control. He saw it as what it was, land to understand, to work with, to share with others who knew its secrets better than he ever would. That knowledge, his own ignorance, his ongoing need to learn, was the greatest gift the wheat harvest had given him. Not wealth, though that had come, not status, though respect had followed. The gift was humility, and in humility, finally, Cunningham had found something approaching peace.